Today in Integrated Rangeland Management here at the University of Idaho, we're going to talk about plant physiology, especially those aspects of the plant's growth and function that affect how plants respond to grazing. So kind of lighthearted, this presentation has evolved over the years. Some work that I did, some from Ben Wisinger, a grad student, and then Steve Bunting took it the last step, so it's a combination of efforts here. Remember, when you talk about plant response to grazing and making plants for any use on the environment, it doesn't matter whether it's going to be eaten by fire or by a grazing animal or going to be used to store water on the environment, the thing that creates that biomass in the plant is, of course, photosynthesis. Many ranchers will talk about the fact that they are not really ranching cattle, they're growing grass, and they keep their focus on this equation, this really important equation about how energy from the sun is turned into chemical energy, and that's the basis on from which we build plant physiological aspects in plant response to disturbance. There's sort of two kinds of carbohydrates we need to keep our eye on. The first products of photosynthesis are non-structural carbohydrates. Those are mostly sugars and starches. So in this equation, that's CH2O for many iterations, N iterations. That's a soluble carbohydrate. That's a sugar. There's also structural carbohydrates, and that's what this arrow is pointing to. These are the leaf cells of a grass, I think, in this case. But remember, plants have those sort of square, long cells, and those long margins are structural carbohydrates, largely cellulose. The cellulose is the most abundant carbohydrate on Earth. Non-structural carbohydrates are things such as those that are the immediate source of energy in the plant, the starches and the sugars. But remember that we're talking about how they're used by animals oftentimes, but those same soluble carbohydrates are used for the function of the plant. So that's how the plant gets its energy for growth and reproduction. One of the most abundant sugars in the plant is sucrose. It's about the second sugar that's made from photosynthesis. It's a major form of the soluble carbohydrates that are transported, through cells in the plant. When sucrose is built into a more complex soluble carbohydrate, it would become starch, and starch is the compound that is stored as energy in the plant. So both of those are soluble. They can be eaten by mammals and digested by mammals. They can be used by plants. They're quite soluble. Structural carbohydrates are a little different. Remember, structural carbohydrates are those those cell margins, usually cell walls. And one unique thing about them is once they're made, they cannot be used again by the plant as energy. They pretty much are turned into sort of the bricks that make the plant or the cell wall, but they can't be turned back in and burned for energy. They also cannot be burned for energy by mammals in most digestive systems. The only way they can really be converted to energy for animals is if that animal has a symbiotic relationship with microbes in their gut, such as ruminants and hindgut fermenters like rabbits and horses. So cellulose, as I mentioned before, is the most abundant and important carbohydrate in plants, and it's the most abundant carbohydrate on Earth. So it's no surprise that animals have developed some way to turn structural carbohydrates into energy. Okay, respiration is basically the opposite of photosynthesis. So if you compare this equation to the one a few slides ago, it's just the reverse. In this case, what plants are doing is taking a sugar, C6H12O2, that's a sugar, adding some oxygen. We all need oxygen to breathe, as do plants, and turning it into carbon dioxide, water, and energy that's used for growth and reproduction. So energy is used then for a bunch of things in the plant. Assimilation, that's a term that really relates mostly to how the plant creates itself, creates growth. It's the synthesis of important plant proteins and carbohydrates. It's energy that is used to uptake minerals and water, and it's also energy that's used to transport metabolites throughout the plant. Maintenance is also an important feature in plants. They have to have some energy to just keep tissue living, keep those enzymes alive and ready to use, and then they also need some energy to respire over the winter. So we talk about plants going into dormancy, and when they're in dormancy, they are just having very low levels of maintenance activity to stay alive, keep tissue alive. Energy is also used for growth, of course, regenerating leaves, stems, roots. Buds are expensive. The meristematic material is expensive to the plant, but they're very important. And then in the context of what we're talking about here, regrowth after grazing, mowing, and fire is important. Reproductive growth is also a pretty big sink for energy in the plant. When the plant goes to elevate that apical meristem and produce a seed head in grasses, that's quite a lot of energy drain. The apical dominance that is expressed by grasses, forbs, and woodies, where they have that apical meristem that is suppressing the other meristems along the stem, that takes energy, and that's part of that reproductive growth requirement. So what affects photosynthesis and respiration in the plant? What affects that rate or the efficiency of either photosynthesis, creating energy, or respiration, using energy? And here's some things to keep track of. The more leaf area a plant has would affect how much it both respires and photosynthesizes, how old the plant is, the quality of light, so the environmental characteristics like light, temperature. Soil moisture is important because that's a resource for growth, soil nutrients. Carbon dioxide is also needed for photosynthesis, so that can influence the efficiency of photosynthesis. And then the efficiency of photosynthate transport is just, how well those material that was created in photosynthesis is transported around the plant. Those are all factors that influence how efficient and how active the plant is. So putting all that together and start to think now about grazing and fire, how those actions affect plant physiology, I'll give us some insight into how plants respond. First of all, grazing and fire removes photosynthetic material. So if you start to graze a plant, or if a fire comes through, or mowing, you remove photosynthetic material. It's going to reduce the amount of energy that is created for the plant for growth and reproduction. Also, when these forces come through and remove plant material, they can remove meristems. And as we've talked, meristems are really important to the plant for growth and reproduction, and they're expensive. They take a lot of energy for the plant to produce. Another thing that grazing and fire do is they change the ratio of live to dead material. It's kind of a little different for each of them. Grazing tends to focus on the live material, and fire tends to focus on the dead material. So those two forces do change the amount of live material in a plant, but in different ways. Grazing and fire also have just mechanical impacts that influence the plant. That you can trample the soil with livestock and grazing animals, so that there's less water available in compact soils. You can also just do some physical damage of breaking branches and removing leaves. And it's interesting that even though we all know that grazing animals might break leaves, there's really not been much research on it, and only recently have people been starting to look at this impact. And then as far as fire, there's also this heat effect, the effect of this fire going through that kills leaves and stems, and of course damages meristems. I'm going to talk a little bit about carbohydrate reserves, because our ability to manage rangelands it's affected by how we look at the resources the plant has for regrowth. Here's some important concepts. This term carbon gain is the amount of leaf area plus the photosynthetic rate. So if you've got a lot of leaf area and a high photosynthetic rate, you're going to gain a lot of carbon. So that term carbon gain comes from that. After grazing, the photosynthetic rate can increase up to 15% in plants, and that's called compensatory photosynthesis. So this is a kind of little trick that is played in this equation. So you've got leaf area and photosynthetic rate, but if you remove some of the leaf area, the remaining leaf area will often see an increase in photosynthetic rate, and that increase in rate is called compensatory photosynthesis. So it helps the plant survive grazing events just by increasing efficiency. Here's a graph that shows that compensatory photosynthesis. That top line there is a plant that was clipped daily. That they're looking at the carbon exchange of a leaf that was not clipped. And when leaves from other parts of that plant were clipped, that leaf increased, or at least maintained, its high exchange rate or photosynthetic rate. The bottom line is a plant that was not clipped, and as that leaf got older in days from 2, 6, 8, 10, it decreased in efficiency. That was because there wasn't anything kind of kicking it into that compensatory photosynthetic rate. So the role that carbohydrate reserves play in plant recovery is really important in terms of how we think about that role. Historically, we believed that carbohydrate reserves were really important and that you couldn't have grazing if the plant didn't have this sort of big bank account of carbon to go to and to provide the necessary energy to recover after grazing. But in contemporary terms, after we've done some research in the last 30 years, we focus now a lot more on the current conditions and the amount of material remaining after grazing. So I'm going to explain the difference between that historic view that was based on carbohydrate reserve and this more contemporary view that's based on the conditions. Okay, here's a graph that really describes that historic view. Basically, from left to right in this graph, they were looking at carbohydrate reserve levels, and they saw that throughout the winter the plant was respiring and just staying alive. And in the spring, when the spring growth started being put on right after buds broke in the spring, the plant started using energy from its stores and put on that top growth and the root growth. So that top line is going up in the spring until about seed stalk. And then we see the plant starting to recover and more energy now going into stores. And then the green part of this graph, we're starting to see a storage of food. So basically on this graph, the plant was using its stored carbon right up to the time that it blossomed and started to produce seeds. And then by that time there was enough leaf material and the plant started putting carbon back into its storage, and it stayed there until it started using it throughout the winter as a source for respiration. So if you believe this model, it's really important to make sure the plant is in a positive carbon gain in that green part of the graph before you might think the plant could survive grazing. So take a good hard look at that before you go on to the next slide and make sure you understand that historic view. The historic view came about because scientists were measuring one kind of carbon. What they were actually measuring was the concentration or the percent of carbon in plant tissue. And in this case, they were measuring the percent of carbon in the root crown. And what they were saying is that as that percent went down, they assumed that the amount of carbon in the plant went down. But so if you follow this historic view of how plants recover from grazing, certainly it was based on this idea that there's a concentration in the plant that goes down. We could measure the plant losing percent of carbohydrates as it started to grow, and that it started to get back into positive carbon balance about the time the plant flowered. So what was important in this theory, if you believed it, was that the things you had to manage with grazing was the timing of defoliation and the amount of rest following defoliation. So assuming the plant's going to get into a positive carbon gain about the time it starts to flower, that would mean you'd want to delay grazing until it flowered and or started to produce seeds. And then once you graze the plant, you needed to give it enough time to build up that store of carbon so that it could survive another event. And so this gave rise to things like range readiness, which required the plant to get to that seed set time. And here's some graphs that show that kind of basis of this, the total non-structural carbohydrates as a percent of root material in this case. You can see TNC, as the herbage yield goes up, the total non-structural carbohydrates go down at first, and then they slowly start to recover as those leaves start to photosynthesize and store carbon again. And not until the plant is about at seed set do you start to see total non-structural carbohydrates kind of start to peak out. If you have a defoliation event, you set that amount of carbohydrates back, because assuming the plant used those carbohydrates to start growth again. And this graph has to do with blue grama. A similar trend can be seen with blue bunch wheatgrass, where the plant continues to grow carbohydrates, and if you graze it, it sets that total non-structural carbohydrate concentration back. Okay, well that's all fine, but as we started to do more research on it in the mid-'80s, boy, there were some things that weren't adding up. The new contemporary theory, the one we follow now, is based on the premises that recovery from a disturbance, such as grazing or fire, is based on the soluble carbohydrates that are coming in, not the ones that are stored in the plants, but it has to do with the amount of carbohydrates that's coming in through new photosynthesis. And the reason that scientists started questioning this theory is because they started measuring the total carbohydrate pools in the plant, not just the concentration, which was the basis for the historic theory, but they started measuring the concentration plus the mass. And what they found was, although concentration goes down, the total pool of carbohydrates available can stay relatively constant because concentration is going down, but mass is going up. The plant is growing more root material, so the actual amount of carbohydrate pools are relatively steady as the plant starts to grow. If you believe this theory then, which I do, which most scientists do today, it's important to manage the intensity of defoliation because the carbohydrates that are going to be necessary to survive or recover from a disturbance is coming not from a big store of carbon, but from photosynthesis, from those leaves that are actively growing. So you need to recover from a disturbance, you need enough plant material, enough leaf material. So you have to have at least a lower level of intensity. You need to pay attention to how much leaf material is remaining. You also have to pay attention to the resources available for recovery. Is there water? Is it the climate, the temperature right for the plant to continue to photosynthesize and produce the carbon it needs to survive the disturbance? So carbohydrates are, in this new theory, I thought much more as just a jump start to growth, just a little battery that gets the car started, rather than a gas tank that is really needed to sustain this recovery. So defoliation then is not as detrimental as it was historically believed. And in fact, one of the big differences about these two theories is that historically it was believed that plants that were young were really susceptible to grazing because they hadn't reached that positive carbon gain. Well, it turns out when plants are young, they're really not very susceptible to grazing because they don't have much demand and there's all the resources they need to recover. So we just kind of really change our view in terms of what's important to help a plant recover from grazing.